Hey, welcome everyone to Crossroads Online. And, every month here at Crossroads, on the fourth Sunday of the month, we do something that we call Four on the Fourth, where we highlight one of our ministry partners and we talk about how we are for our community. See, here at Crossroads, we want to be known more for what we're for. We're for our community, we're for people here in Westminster, Carroll County, and beyond, rather than what we're against. And one of the affiliate ministries that we want to highlight this month is what we call breaking ground. Here at Crossroads, we just believe in healing and restoration. We believe that it's possible, that growth is possible for everyone. And so Breaking Ground is a counseling service that has a website that connects people, individuals, with fantastic counselors that are part of here at Crossroads Church. And so we serve all kinds of people here in Westminster, all over Carroll County, and all over the United States, actually. And whatever you're facing in life right now, whether it's a relationship problem, personal struggles, maybe you just need someone to talk to, we want you to know that we have someone that's here for you here at the Breaking Ground Counseling Center. And so when you go to the website, one of the things you're going to see is this incredible testimonies of people that have gone through counseling, actual people, individuals who've gone through and experienced transformation as a result of going through Breaking Ground counseling. And so I just want to read a couple of these. You could find them on the website as well. One person in their late 20s said, "My counselor helped me overcome debilitating anxiety, both in my early college years and then in my marriage. And I know that my life would be in a totally different trajectory without her wisdom and care." Another person said this, "Now, there was a time in my life where my wife and I just couldn't seem to connect. We tried communicating on our own. We just kept missing each other. Our Breaking Ground counselor gave us tools and exercises to understand each other and to get back on the same page." Our heart at Crossroads is for people who are hurting, people that are going through challenging seasons. We've all been there. And that's just one way that we are for our community here at Crossroads Church. And so if you want to learn more about the Breaking Ground, you can go to this website, thebreakingground.com, and get connected with one of our counselors. Let me say a prayer for that ministry, for everyone that's experiencing some kind of struggle, which we're going to talk about that in our message in just a moment here, but let me pray. Lord, I just pray for this ministry of Crossroads Church, the Breaking Ground Counseling Center, Lord, and I just pray for every person that's a part of it, every counselor, every person that's stepping up and saying, "Lord, I have a situation, a circumstance in my life," and I just pray that we would see transformation, that people would make decisions for faith, that people would see you and experience you through it. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. One decision in life can change everything, either for the good or for the bad. And in fact, when you look back in history, it's interesting because some of the most pivotal moments in all of history started with one person who made one choice, and sometimes even one choice, one small choice that could change all of history, and we don't even really think about it. Some of these people just fly under the radar. We don't talk about them all that often. And we kind of think about the moments in history that change everything, like battles or some historic event that happens. But so often it's just one decision. And that's true. That was true for Desmond Doss. Desmond Doss, maybe you've heard of him. I'm going to guess many of us haven't. Now, this guy right here, Desmond Doss, he looks like a soldier, right? There's only one thing about Desmond Doss. While he looks like a soldier, and he was a part of World War II, he refused to carry a gun. Can you imagine? I mean, it's terrifying to go into battle while you're carrying a gun. At least you have some kind of protection. Desmond Doss said, "I'm not going to carry a gun," because he just felt like God was calling him to something different. He didn't feel like he could do that. And so he went into war, and every single person, all the soldiers there, they made fun of him. They they belittled him. They mocked him. And then Desmond found himself in a terrible battle. And that battle was Hacksaw Ridge. And here Desmond is in the middle, and he sees the carnage. He sees the destruction. He sees his friends injured, soldiers fallen all over this battleground. And Desmond makes a choice. He says, "I'm going to go and I'm going to I'm going to save these people. I may not want to carry a gun. I may not be carrying a gun, but I'm going to care for some people." And one person after another, he pulled injured soldiers out of the rubble of this battle. And that day, 75 people, he saves the lives of 75 soldiers that day because Desmond made one faith decision. And as he was doing that, his prayer, as he was going through this moment, said, Lord, just help me save one more. Help me just save one more person. And this one decision changed the course of so many people's lives. One decision changed everything. Now, that's not just true in history. I mean, you could look at one example like that after another, but it was true as you look back the people in Scripture. And in Hebrews 11, we're going to talk today about the story of Moses. And what we're going to see is that his story was not just shaped by chance, it was shaped by choices that he made. And every by faith moment in Moses' life was tied to a decision that he had to make. And this bold faith decision that he made would shape his story and eventually would shape all of history and the story that God was telling. And so we're in this series right now entitled By Faith. By Faith. And we're walking through this classic passage in Hebrews chapter 11. Sometimes it's called the Hall of Faith. And the Hall of Faith, as you read through this passage, is one person after another, one man or woman who made an incredible faith decision, who changed history, who had some incredible faith in their lives. And here's the common thread as you look through all of these people as we've been through this series over the last weeks, that faith for these individuals was not just something they believed, faith was something that they did. Faith was not just a belief for them. Faith was an action. They lived it out, and that's what changed their lives and changed the lives of the people around him. And again, we're looking today at Moses, this one man that God used to take the Israelites out of slavery, to take God's people out of slavery in Egypt. And this is one of the greatest deliverance stories in all of history, probably the single greatest deliverance story in all of history. But it didn't happen by accident. It happened because Moses made these decisions, and they're the same kinds of decisions that we can make in our lives today. We have so much to learn from Moses. And here's what I think we're going to learn today. Here's what I hope you see today, is that faith isn't just believing, it's deciding. It's in one bold faith decision in your life today shapes the big story that God is going to tell in your life tomorrow. Faith is not just believing, faith is deciding. And so we're going to take a look at Hebrews 11, starting in verse 23. And as we read through this passage in just a moment, I want you to notice this phrase that comes up again and again, 4 times throughout this passage, where it says, by faith. And then watch how each one of these is a decision that Moses makes. So let's start again in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as the greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He preserved what he saw in him who was invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Now, as you look through this passage, which is really kind of a pass-through, it's an overview of all of Moses' life, you see 4 times that by faith is repeated, connected to Moses' story. And each time it's connected to a different chapter, a different decision that Moses makes. And as I was praying, I just was looking at this and I said, you know what? Every one of these is a decision where it was faith or something else. It was a faith decision that shaped that season and that chapter in Moses' life. And so what I want you to see and what I hope you'll see in Moses' life and what I think you can find for each of us in our lives as well is that our lives are a series of decisions to choose faith. And today we're going to look at these 4 decisions that Moses made. These are the 4 faith decisions that Moses made as we look at those 4 moments that are described in the scriptures by faith. He chose faith over comfort. Moses chose faith over fear. Moses chose faith over control. And then Moses chose faith over certainty. And so let's look at the first decision, faith over comfort. That's at the beginning of Moses' life, the calling that Moses found on his life. And it was choosing God's calling over the convenience and the comfort of the palace that he was living in. Now, let me just start with this. When I say comfort, I mean every one of us loves comfort. We want our life to be comfortable. No one would vote for an uncomfortable life, right? But what if I told you that maybe the biggest enemy to God's plan for you and what God has for you and God's story for you isn't doubt? We're talking about faith. It's not just faith and doubt. Maybe the biggest enemy to your calling and God's purpose for you is actually comfort in your life. You know, we all focus on comfort. We want a comfortable couch. We want a comfortable job. We want comfortable relationships. So often we avoid risks in life because it just feels like it's kind of uncomfortable. And I have to wonder, as I've sat back, prayed about this, thought about it, and then just really seen this in the lives of people as I've been a pastor over the last 15, 20 years, is how many times do people miss God's best for them because they're simply too comfortable? In fact, like honestly, I would say it like this. What I've observed and what I've seen, and maybe even in my own life I've seen this, is that the more comfortable that you are in your life, the harder it is for God to get your attention. When you're comfortable, God just has a hard time getting your attention. But this is the situation that Moses is in. He's living the comfortable life. This is Exodus 2:11 says this, "One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." So here's what's going on. Again, Moses is living in the palace here in this moment. He's living in the palace connected to Pharaoh, a grandson of Pharaoh. And he grew up at this time in the greatest empire in all of the world. I mean, he grew up as an adopted son of Pharaoh. Even though he was not an Egyptian, he grew up adopted in that household, and he grew up with the best education, the best food. I mean, he had access to anything. This was an opulent life. He had the best clothes. He had the best chariot. I mean, life was taken care of for Pharaoh, for Moses because of Pharaoh. But even though Moses had this great life and everything was taken care of, something inside of him just felt unsettled. I mean, even though he had been educated as an Egyptian and grew up in Pharaoh's house, he knew that he wasn't actually an Egyptian, that he was adopted, and that his people were actually the Hebrews, God's people, who were enslaved in Egypt at that time. And as he came to understand this, and he wrestled with this in his life, even though his life was comfortable, this idea began to overwhelm him, began to overwhelm Moses. And so Moses had this choice. He could have stayed in the palace for the rest of his days, eaten the best food, ignored the suffering of his people, continued to live this life of privilege. But Moses here in this moment made a choice to step outside of the comfort and to step into the suffering of God's people. And Moses knew he had this bigger calling. He knew that God was calling him to more. He knew there was a bigger story that God had for him. And this one moment, this one decision changed his life. Now, unfortunately, as you just read a second ago there, while that was a great idea for Moses to take a step out of the comfort, the way he did it was not great. The what was good, I'm going to step out of comfort and God has something more for me. But then the how he did it was not great. Instead of seeking God's guidance as he takes this step, as he sees the suffering of God's people, Moses says, I'm going to just take measures into my own hands here. He saw someone being mistreated and he looks around and what does he do? Out of anger, he murders someone. And he hoped that no one would notice. And so he's kind of coming around the next day hoping that it had gone unseen. Spoiler alert, it does not go unseen. This is what we see in verse 13. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. You think. And so Moses' life is no longer safe. And as this word got out, Pharaoh actually wanted him dead. His own people, the Hebrews, rejected him. And the palace, the place where he found safety and comfort, was no longer an option, and so Moses had to run. And this is the same reality for us so often in our lives for us as well. Sometimes following God, oftentimes, in fact, I think all the time, following God and what God has for you, it means leaving comfort behind, walking away from comfort. And so is there something in your life that God's been nudging you towards? Just reflect on this right now, this week, whatever it is. And God's nudging you towards something, but you're saying, God, I'm just kind of comfortable right here. I don't want to take a step that direction. Maybe you feel God's pushing you into the unknown, and that terrifies you. And is there a step of faith that maybe God has for you? See, Moses chose faith over comfort, changed his life, but that first chapter was just one first step for him. And now Moses has the next chapter, which is faith over fear. The next decision that we see Moses has to make in his life. And so here's the situation. Moses has to leave Egypt, and what does he do? He flees into the wilderness. He's out in the middle of nowhere, living out in the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years he's out living life out in the fields. At this point, Moses has to think, this is it. Like, you know what? I'm just living life out here with the sheep, out in the middle of the wilderness for the rest of my life. I've got a criminal past. I'm like a fugitive on the run here in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden, God breaks into the ordinary, the mundane, and the monotonous in Moses' life, and he shows up. Can you imagine this scene? Moses is just doing what he's done every day for the last 40 years. He's out there taking care of the sheep, doing what he has to do, probably has a coffee in his hand, whatever he's doing, going through the motions. And out in the distance, he sees a burning bush. He doesn't think that much of it. But then as he moves closer to it, the living God shows up and speaks these words to Moses. In Exodus 3 says this, God calls Moses at the burning bush. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? So Moses gets this moment, this wake-up moment, this holy moment where God shows up and he says, you're going to face Pharaoh face to face, and you're going to set my people free. And what do you think? Moses is hearing this idea, go back and confront Pharaoh. Do you think Moses is like, great idea, God. I love it. It's just, here I am. I'm ready to go. I'm packing my bags right now. No, that is not Moses' first reaction. What is Moses' first reaction? He says, you want me to do what? And who am I, he says. Who am I to do this? I'm just a guy out in the field. I'm just a guy with a criminal past. In this moment, he had to make this decision in his life between faith and fear. And this is a decision that we all wrestle with every day of our lives. It's under the surface of so many decisions in our lives. And so it might go like this, who am I? Who am I to share my faith with someone? Who am I to step out and be a part of student ministry and invest in the next generation? Who am I to step up and be a part of the worship team? Who am I to make this move in my career or in my family? And instead, what do? We play it safe. And we choose fear over faith. And the more that we choose fear over faith, the more that we're stuck in the wilderness of life. And sometimes we wonder, why does it feel like I'm just stuck? I'm stuck in the wilderness. It doesn't feel like I'm moving forward. And being stuck in the wilderness in life is hard. And fear has this voice, and we begin listening to this voice in our lives. And the voice of fear says this, maybe I'm not enough. Maybe you're not ready. If you step out, you're going to fail. And if you've experienced that, if you heard that before, you're in good company. Moses felt the same way. And that's exactly what Moses is experiencing here. In fact, Moses just kind of like coughs up one excuse after another. I mean, it's just like rapid fire. And he says this, who am I to do this? What if they don't believe me? What if I'm not a good speaker? And so how does God respond to all the things that Moses is saying? Does God kind of give Moses a pep talk? Yes, you are. You're a great speaker. Moses, you're going to be excellent. Yes, you're good enough. Yes, you're strong enough. God does not say that. No, he says what? I'll be with you. That's all he says. I'll be with you. And here's what we find in this moment. Fear focuses on your weaknesses, while faith focuses on God's strength. Moses was focused on his weaknesses. He was not focused on God's strength. And so fear says, maybe I'm not enough. And faith says, God, you're more than enough. You're more than enough in my life. And something changes in Moses' heart as he hears God speak to him and he says, I'm going to be with you. And this faith begins to grow. And it's really grown from every decision he's made in his life up to this point. But you watch it grow in every moment and every chapter of his life. And this faith begins to well up in his heart. And suddenly he moves and he shifts from asking, what if I fail? And he begins asking, what if God shows up? What if God actually shows up? And I just wonder what would happen if we began to ask that question more often in our lives as well. Moses ultimately does what God asked him to do, step out of the wilderness and go and confront Pharaoh in Egypt. And here's what I have to ask you to think about, to consider as we look at this chapter and as we think about this decision that Moses made, is what's the fear that's keeping you from stepping into what God has for you? Because I can promise you, there's some fear that's stopping you from the future God has for you. And part of what we have to do is to take a look at that and be honest. What's the fear that's stopping you from obeying God in your life? That's not allowing you to fully trust him in a circumstance, in a situation. And what would happen if you just said, you know what if God shows up in my life? Listen, if we live in fear, it doesn't just get smaller. The fear in our life grows and gets bigger, and sometimes it can even overwhelm us. And the only way to overcome the fear in our life is to step out in faith, and that's what we see in the life of Moses. But we know that this was not the end. I mean, Moses had an incredible story up to this point. This is not the end. This is not the last chapter. What we see next is this next decision, and this is a hard one for all of us, faith over control. So what happens? Moses goes to Egypt, and he's on this mission to save and free God's people, the Hebrews, the Israelites. But Pharaoh's not real excited about this idea, right? He doesn't want to lose like 2 million people, free slave labor. He's not real excited about this idea. You know, I don't know if Moses just thought he was going to go in there and Pharaoh was going to say, sure, Moses, no problem. Sounds good. That's not the way it went. But just think about this. Moses steps out of the wilderness. He'd been in the wilderness for 40 years. But God's people, the Israelites, had been in captivity in Egypt for 400 years. 400 years. They've been crying out for rescue. 400 years. And all of a sudden, God shows up in the person of Moses to free them from Egyptian slavery. Now, again, I don't know how Moses thought this was going to go, but what ends up happening here is this incredible showdown between Pharaoh on one side and God on the other. And you can read this entire story if you want to. But it just turns out that God had a message for Pharaoh that, hey, I'm God and you're not. And Pharaoh was not real receptive to that message. In fact, Pharaoh, it turns out, was a little bit stubborn. He was not getting the message. And so God did what he had to do, and he sent a series of plagues, one after another, terrible calamities that fell upon the nation of Egypt, that God basically, he was not trying to be cruel in this moment to Pharaoh, but he was just trying to get the message that I'm God and you're not. And yes, God's people, my people, the Hebrews, are going to be set free. And then finally, though, after Pharaoh's heart was hardened again and again, and he refused to set the Israelites free, eventually God said, I've had enough. We see this in Exodus 11. At midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there ever has been or ever will be again. Now, this was the final plague. After all the other terrible things, the calamities that had fallen upon the nation, this was finally the way God's like, I'm going to break your resistance, Pharaoh, and you're going to see my people set free. And so God, though, provided a way out for the Hebrews that were living here in this time, that they would not suffer the same fate. And he gave the same out, he gave the same idea, he gave the same rescue plan to anyone in Egypt at that time that would simply trust in him and follow this command. He would spare them. This is what we read in Exodus 2. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it into the blood in the basin and put some of the blood on the top of both sides of the doorframe. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and the sides of the door frame, and he will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses or strike you down. Now, I just want to say, if you're new to church, maybe you're new to faith, you're just exploring this, this whole thing sounds a little bit strange, right? I mean, we're talking about blood on door frames and the firstborn and what's happening here and the death of the firstborn of people in Egypt. What are we talking about? And maybe you're asking questions, and I wouldn't blame you if you're saying, like, if God's a loving God, then why is there judgment in this situation? And why? And what does this have to do with my life today, really, if I look at it? Look, those are fair questions, and I just want to say I get it, I understand. But here's what's important to understand as you really understand the heart of this story. That Passover, this moment, was not about destruction. It was about rescue. It was about God had a rescue plan. And God really provided grace for anyone who was willing to follow him. And it was a moment where God said, I have a way out for my people. I'm going to make a way where there is no way for my people. And when you read this whole story, you realize not just that God is going to step out and there's this moment where there's judgment, but what you really read as you read this entire story is how patient God is. I mean, one thing after another, he gives one chance to Pharaoh after another, one moment, another chance after another chance. And what I see here, though, under the surface of this entire story is this choice that Moses had to make and each one of us have to make. And really every family in this time, whether it was an Egyptian family or it was an Israelite family, they all had the same choice between faith and control, whether they were going to listen to God's command. And so Moses had to choose to trust God in this moment and to give up control. I mean, what, God, you're going to do what? You're going to pass over and how? You're going to save us? Are you sure I'm not going to get mixed up in this thing with the firstborns and you're going to spare our life and our family and our kids? But this sounds a little bit scary, God. I mean, he had no control of this situation. It wasn't just that, but it was also like, this is your plan, God? Like, you're going to do with the blood and the doorposts? Like, can I come up with a different plan, God? Can we talk about this a little bit? I could come up with a little different way to make this thing happen. What did Moses have to do? He had to say, look, I'm not in control. Early in his life, he chose to take control. He took it into his own hands, and bad things happened. In this situation, he said, I'm going to choose to trust you. I'm not in control. I'm not God. This is not my plan. This is your plan. God, I trust you. I put faith over control in my life. Now, control feels safe. We all like knowing what's going to happen next. We all know we like knowing the next chapter in the story. We like keeping things predictable. But guess what? Control in your life is actually an illusion. I mean, at the end of the day, we all think we're in control, and then there's moments in life where we realize, and maybe you've had these moments where you realize, I'm not actually in control. We want to plan our future. Turns out life is unpredictable. We want to fix our problems. There's all kinds of things that we find out are out of our control. We want to manage outcomes in our life, but God asks us to choose to trust him instead. But let's just be honest, most of us don't do that all the time. We don't ever do that perfectly. We want to trust God as long as he gives us the plan in the first place. And maybe you notice that Moses faced this exact struggle. And so he had this choice. What am I going to do? Am I going to choose to trust you, or am I going to take matters into my own hands? Am I going to give you control, or am I going to choose faith here in this life? And so let me ask this question for each one of us here. Where is God asking you to trust him, but you're just holding on? You're holding on to control because control feels easier in life. Now, I want to wrap up with this. This is the last chapter in Moses' life. Just think about this. Look back on Moses' life. All of Moses' life up to this point had been a series of decisions. Every chapter had been marked by a decision that he made to choose faith. And one decision after another, he chose faith over comfort, leaving the palace behind. He chose faith over fear, standing up to Pharaoh and demanding freedom. He chose faith over control in the Passover. And all of those choices that he made led him up to this moment where he had another choice, faith over certainty. Moses led people out of something that was certain. It may not have been comfortable. It may not have been good. They were in slavery, but it was certain. They had the basics covered. They had a roof over their head. They kind of knew what to expect while they were slaves in Egypt. As they stepped away and as Moses led them, they had no idea what was going to happen next. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't have a plan. They had no way of making sure that they were going to have food or they're going to have the basics covered. And maybe you know what happens next as they begin to march out of Egypt, these 2 million slaves, Hebrew slaves, God's people, marching out of Egypt. Pharaoh has this change of heart and he decides he's going to chase them down as they're leaving. And it just turns out that Pharaoh was in control of the most powerful military in the world at that time. And so you can imagine there's just a bunch of like older people, young kids, moms with little babies. They're carrying their goods and the basics of whatever they could grab with them. And they're trying to carry their belongings with them. And they're just trying to make it out of this situation and leave Egypt. And as they're walking away and as they're running away, as they're fleeing, suddenly behind them is this powerful army that includes chariots and it chooses swords and rage, and they're just chasing after right behind them. And there's Moses standing in the middle, 2 million Israelites, and behind them is this army, and in front of them they are trapped. There's the Red Sea. There's nowhere to go. They have them cornered. You can imagine Pharaoh thinks, this is it. God saved you up to this point. You've had all these incredible things happen. Where are you going to go now? What are you going to do now? You got a sea in front of you, and I've got an army coming at you. There's no way out. Maybe you felt like that at some point in your life as well. God, how are you going to show up? What are you going to do? How is it possible that you could lead me through this? And so for the first time, though, the Israelites standing there in this situation, and you can't blame them, they had seen God do incredible things up to this point to lead them out of the nation of Egypt. But at this moment, what do? They panic. 14:11 of Exodus says, they turned to Moses and said, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die? We should have stayed in Egypt. In other words, like, wow, Moses, great job, buddy. You're bringing us out here to die. Can you imagine the situation? The fear that they're feeling, the doubt that they're feeling. They're so close to this promise. After 400 years in captivity, they're so close to freedom. And it seemed like it was impossible. And so Moses right here in this moment, his whole life led up to this moment, Moses had a choice. Moses could have panicked right alongside of them. Moses could have said, you know what, you're right. I'm going to talk to Pharaoh. We're going to turn around. We're going to figure this out. He could have questioned everything. No, instead, what does Moses do? He stepped forward in faith. And the only reason that this moment makes sense is all the decisions that he had made leading up to this. It made perfect sense for him to step forward in this moment. But it was only because he had made all these other decisions leading up to this moment in his life. Exodus 14. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still. And then God gave the most unexpected command. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Move on? Like, where are we going to move on? God, there's a Red Sea standing in front of us. Like, there's nowhere to go. We're going to move on to take a swim? What are we doing here? But then Moses raises his staff, and in this moment, the waters part. In this giant body of water, there's 2 walls of water on either side. The Red Sea parts, and there's dry ground in the middle stretched before them. And what happens is they had to walk forward in their moment of doubt and in their moment of fear before they knew how it was going to end. They had to take a step forward before they knew God was going to part the waters in the first place. And every step that they took in this, leading up to this, was a step of faith. They didn't know as they were walking through these waters if the waters were going to hold or if they were going to come crashing down. They didn't know what was going to happen, that Pharaoh's army was going to continue to chase after them and catch them. They didn't know what was waiting for them on the other side of the Red Sea. What did God have for them on the other side? But every step they took another step of faith. They believed God, that God was good and that God was in control. And right in this moment, as they reach the other side of the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army is coming in behind them, giving chase to them, the Red Sea comes crashing down. And their oppressors that had lorded over them for 400 years, in a moment, in an instant, was destroyed right before their eyes. And here's what we see in this story, is that faith moves before you see the outcome. Man, is that hard. It's so hard to live this out. I mean, it's true. It's so true, but it is so hard. We all like certainty. We want to know that the job's going to work out before we take it. The relationship's going to work out before we take it. That God's got provision before we take the step, whatever it is. But faith doesn't work that way. Faith moves before the waters part. As we take the step, God shows up. Now, we don't like stepping into the unknown. We don't like having the story unwritten. We'd rather have the full plan, but that we want to know what's going to happen. We want to know that God's going to show up the way we want him to show up. But there's a chance, there's an opportunity in each one of our lives. God's taking you to take a step of faith. He's asking you to take a step of faith. And maybe, I don't know what your situation is, whether it's a faith over comfort, a faith over fear, a faith over control, a faith over certainty. Every one of us has a different situation that God's asking us to step into. Maybe it feels like you're standing and right in front of you is the Red Sea and you're wondering, God, I have no idea how you're going to show up in this circumstance. We want to give you a really tangible way for you to respond here today. In fact, here's what I'm going to ask everyone to do. Just find a piece of paper and simply write this: by faith, ... and then fill in the blank. By faith, ... and then fill in the blank. That maybe it's right here in this moment. You're going to take a few minutes. You're going to pause. Maybe later on, you're going to come back this week and take some time to reflect on that question. But what is God asking you? What step is God asking you to take? What decision is God asking you to make? We've been talking about faith for the last 4 weeks. What decision are you going to make by faith in your life? And what is God calling you to? Maybe it's by faith, I'm going to trust God with my future. By faith, I'm going to trust God with this medical problem. By faith, I'm going to forgive someone. By faith, I'm going to say yes to what God is calling me to do, even though it feels really uncomfortable. You know, Moses had no idea how his story was going to end. He just knew that God was calling him to something. He was calling him to take a step forward out in faith. You know, life is a series of decisions, and every decision shapes the story that God tells in your life and in my life. And my hope and my prayer for you is that you would choose faith and watch how God's going to show up. Let me pray. Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity that we have to be reminded of what a life of faith looks like as we look at the life of Moses. And we're also encouraged that while Moses didn't get it right all the time, and we certainly don't get it right all the time, but at the end of the day, Lord, I just pray that even despite all of our mistakes and our shortcomings, and the times that we fall short, and the times that we doubt, and the times that we wonder where you are, that we would be able to look back and say, you know what? I live my life by faith. By faith. I took a step. By faith, I trusted God. And I believe that you're going to work and move in the lives of every person. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.